Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. That's where you're going to find Don and
Alexis.
And we're going to be talking into microphones, and we're going to be talking about, I don't know, what are we likely to be talking about today, Lex?
Alternate history of some sort?
Yeah, that's sort of what we do here on A Fork in Time. And I know we mention that sort of every time we lead a podcast episode off, but that's because we have to make sure we're distinguishing ourselves from another podcast. We're going to talk about that here in a minute. But this morning, or today, or whatever time it is, it's actually in the evening. I just realized here as we're recording. I've been in this room a long time today.
Well, I usually listen to podcasts in the morning, so it could be morning when you're listening to this.
It could be morning, it could be afternoon, it could be like I do sometimes, listening to a podcast as I fall asleep. Hopefully we're not the podcast that you choose when you want to go to sleep.
I can't do that.
The problem with that is I will fall asleep, and then I have to go back and listen to figure out where I was.
Maybe that's why I don't do that.
Yeah. So now that we've wandered around here for the better part of a minute, welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Don and Alexis in the dual two-seat version today. And we're going to do what I'm going to call a shotgun episode today, if that makes any sense. Lex, you see where I'm going with that?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, we're not actually going to be talking about firearms. We're actually going to be talking about what essentially would be a recurrent theme through history. In fact, we could have probably turned this into a 4 or 5 episode
series,
themes. Then we may come back and do that at some point, because it's not limited to a couple of different places. But we're going to talk generally about a concept today that is, I guess it's probably the root of a lot of particular things that would be alternate history. It's just that we don't often think about them because they are... The way that I'm going to describe this thing when you mentioned this topic to me, Alexis, is... I don't think of this topic necessarily by its specifics as much as I think about it by its generalities, because the number of specifics that would actually exist are like...
Infinite?
Almost feel like they're infinite, exactly right. And so what we're really going to be doing today, and I think we've teased it for long enough here, we're really going to be looking today is what if there had not been the concept throughout most of monarchical, is that a word?
Sure.
Yeah, why not?
Go for it.
Monarchical history, this idea that's known as primogeniture. And so how, just in general, might things have been different without primogeniture? Then I think we'll look at some individual examples. And like I said, this will probably lead to, I'll actually throw this out there now. Listeners, if you have particular examples of particular episode ideas you'd like us to pursue, that's exactly why you should visit www.aforkintimepodcast.com. And see where the show notes are there and the topical suggestions are and all the wonderful things you can do at our very primitive but very effective little website. And one of the things you could do would be suggest a particular episode, a particular instance of this.
Yeah.
And maybe the more obscure that reference would be, but also the more impactful, the better. So today here on A Fork in Time, we're going to look at what if there had not been primogeniture. Well, I guess a good place to start is what in the world is primogeniture, Lex?
Basically, it is the concept that the first male in a bloodline gets the throne. And that really comes into play if the first child is a female, because if she has a younger brother, she automatically gets skipped over in primogeniture. It's always that the firstborn male, even if he could be the second, third, fourth, fifth, 10th child, gets to be the next monarch.
Correct. And so and let me just be clear about this, we probably will spend a lot of time in one of Alexis's favorite little places on earth, because that's where a lot of this time of history exists. But this is not limited to the way that the English monarchy functions, correct?
Correct, and that's why I'd be interested to hear from our listeners if they know some examples, specifically if they're kind of the more obscure. Maybe there's examples of this in Asia or Africa, or, I mean, I think we tend to focus a lot on the European, and I tend to focus a lot on the English, British, Scottish side of it, but this happens all over the world, not just Europe, not just England.
Yeah, and one of the things that's interesting to me, and to some degree, here's a pitch for our patron series on Patreon, which is in the late Bronze Age collapse. This is not necessarily something that throughout history has always been the case. The first place that jumps to mind for me is Egypt, where it was very common. In fact, it was very common in Egypt for siblings to marry each other. This was the way they kept the bloodline sort of pure and did other things as well. Of course, it introduced all kinds of wonderful little inherited and
anomalies
and recession kind of stuff, as we've talked about in other episodes. But for example, a queen of Egypt or a queen, they sort of got around this in a way, in the sense that yes, it was the male who was the pharaoh for the most part, but the position of the queen being just another member of the family if they married their sisters. So that's how they solved this issue of primogeniture, which is not necessarily what I'd recommend as the best solution for it. But
it's
that's
a solution.
It's a solution. But that's how they solved it. But for most, as you mentioned, for most monarchies globally, for most of history, it has been the only way that you ended up with a queen was through the accident of no male heirs.
Correct.
And so probably the most famous example that, or one of the most famous examples of that, certainly in English history, would be Elizabeth I.
Well, and her older sister Mary.
And all of this, of course, when we've spent so many episodes, we didn't want to focus around the things here, because this is just yet another way you could not have Henry VIII become
Henry VIII.
Right. And the things that came from that for him not having a surviving male heir. And so we're going to talk. Well, actually, we'll talk about that a little bit as an example.
This gets you to know Henry VIII, but in a different way than we've talked about before.
Right. And as we've talked about on a number of times before, and we're not apologetic for that. It's just the reality of it for the reasons that are there, because that's a very interesting part of history and the various what-ifs that exist there. But it's an entirely different set of what-ifs, because it's an entirely different, not different cast of characters, but different roles that the cast of characters play.
Correct.
If that's a fair way to describe it.
Mm-hmm.
So, again, later, so just using England as the example here, they eventually move away from this concept of primogeniture, meaning that the male gets preferred regardless of birth order. When do they finally move away from that?
That would be 2015.
2015 seems a little late.
A little bit. So this was finally gotten rid of as a concept with the, actually, I'm lying, it was 2013. This was finally gotten rid of as a concept in 2013. That is when William and Catherine, the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, who were not the second in line, but the third in line, and then their subsequent children. This is when their first child was born, George. Of course, he happened to be a boy, but that is when they got rid of the concept, so that if he had been a girl, she would not have been superseded by a younger brother. Much the same way so we had George in 2013, we had Charlotte in 2015, then in 2018 we had Louis. A good example of this is Charlotte holds her spot. She is not superseded by her younger brother because we've gotten rid of primogeniture.
Okay, so it only took, till now.
Yeah, basically.
And so, again, a lot has happened in history. A lot has happened in history because of monarchs, and a lot of those monarchs either came to power or did not come to power as a result of their gender.
Mm-hmm.
And the timing and who it was and when it was and all of that was impacted by that. So when we come back from just a quick break from this discussion here on the podcast, we're going to pick back up with this idea of what if there had been no primogeniture. We're going to look for a couple of examples of that and just talk a little bit or flesh out a little bit about how that would be different. And I think really what the focus will be, since we're not going to focus so much on individual events today, would be to actually just talk about what does this mean for the general flow of history in terms of what's there. So we hope that you stick with us when we pick the topic back up here in a little bit. All right, Don and Alexis here, taking just a quick break from the podcast to talk about something else that's not a sponsor, it's not a product, it's not a whatever. What are we going to talk about, Lex?
Another podcast?
Another podcast. Is it a podcast that we know anything about?
A little bit.
Yeah, that podcast you might have guessed already because we've sort of not been able to not mention it on almost every episode here, is The Room Where It Happened. Now, the interesting thing about The Room Where It Happened, it's another podcast from our, what is our now family of 2 podcasts, but our family
We're
of
growing.
podcasts, yeah, here at Fork in Town, we've doubled, um, is that it is, not that it's going to happen, which is what it was for some period of time, but it is now actually
Happened.
and happening.
Yes.
And so one of the things that you can do as a listener, if you haven't already found it, if you enjoy what we do here on A Fork in Time, we suggest you to at least try out The Room Where It Happened. Now, it is a history podcast, so in that sense it is the same, but what's different about it, Lex?
It is actual history.
Actual history. Now, we end up talking about actual history so often when we're talking about alternate history. In fact, we've talked before about that's one of the great things of alternate history. It's a way to better understand and interpret the impact of actual history.
Mm-hmm.
But The Room Where It Happened actually doesn't focus on alternate history as its primary mode of operation. It focuses on what we call metaphorically the room.
Mm-hmm.
And so the room is where a location, for the most part in history, where something happened or something influential was there. And so the concept for each episode is there's a room. In fact, that's in the title of the episode. And so, for example, Lex, what was room 1? Room number 1.
It was the sitting room, living room, parlor, where Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson decided the 790 Compromise.
And don't forget James Madison was there.
Yeah, James Madison too.
So the Compromise of 1790, and it was sometimes referred to as the dinner table bargain.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, as we talk about on that episode and the things that lead up to it, it's actually the inspiration for the song and the musical Hamilton, from which the title of the podcast owes its derivation from.
And which I had stuck in my head the entire night we recorded that episode. It made it very hard to sleep, I'm just saying.
There you go. But the other thing about that episode is that, here on A Fork in Time, it might be just me, it might be just Alexis, it might be Alexis and myself, or it might be Chris Coppola, who's our standing contributor, or any of the other folks that are there. But what's the other thing that's different or unique about a room in The Room Where It Happened was?
You were making some weird crossover there. What's unique about it is that we are not aiming to be on every episode.
Correct.
We are hoping to build... We're already building a community here, but we're hoping to expand that community with The Room Where It Happened. So we're inviting people to go to our website. We haven't branched out on website yet. You still find The Room Where It Happened on aforkandtimepodcast.com. But you can go to that website, go to the tab for The Room Where It Happened, and you can sign up if you'd like to participate, and we want participation on all levels.
Yeah, for example, our first episode, the first of the, and we'll talk a little bit, just very briefly about the format. I don't want to do the whole show about the other show. But in that particular episode, we had five folks that were part of the discussion there, and our goal is to have that, or maybe even sometimes a little bit more on each episode. It's a longer form podcast, releasing once a month, and as Alexis just said, a lot of opportunity for interaction. And so we invite you to go to their forums on the website.
I was going to say, we technically had 6 people on that episode because we had a contributor who wasn't there who provided questions.
That's correct. We had Brody Burton from Imagine If, who had suggested some things that we talked about with the others that were there. So, again, one of the things, as Alexis just said, you can find information about that, including links to the podcast feed and other things on the website for www.aforkandtimepodcast.com. The other thing you'll find is in the show notes for this particular episode. There'll be the link there, and the links that I'll include there, I think, are the links to what we call it's sort of the overview show. It's the introductory episode. It gives some background, introduces the topic, and then also I'll include, in addition to the feed link, I'll also include the actual room number 1. And we've already announced what the topic is for room number 2, but you'll have to stay tuned for that. So anything else we need to bore the listeners about here for The Room Where It Happened, Lex?
I don't think so. We hope you check it out. Like we said, it's not going to release as frequently as A Fork in Time does, but a little longer podcast and still interesting topics. So we hope you check it out.
I hope you do too. All right. So here we're back on A Fork in Time, the Alternate History Podcast. Don and Alexis exploring gender issues throughout history here, but particularly gender issues when it comes to royalty.
Mm-hmm.
So This is also one of those episodes where we didn't spend tons of time in prep. It's a little bit more of a spontaneous episode, which I like those sometimes. So, Alexis, do you even know what the origin is of the concept of primogeniture? Is it just has it all? Is there something that you're aware of that can be pointed to?
I mean, I was kind of thinking about this kind of before we started recording and kind of off podcast. I was like, is this in the Bible? Which is kind of when I think, far away historical documents, that was kind of the first thing that popped in my head. Obviously, we have some other documents that are that old as well. But I was like, I'm sure this kind of concept exists in the Bible. The first thing that kind of popped in my head was, King David. And it was like going down the order of the sons. And it was like, not him, not him, not him, not him. Do you have any other ones? Well, I have the youngest one. Of course, they were all boys in that story. But that was kind of the farthest back in history that my brain kind of went.
Yeah, and I was thinking about, particularly for me, the same thing I mentioned. I was thinking about Egypt and how they sort of have a loophole around this in a weird kind of way, but still also not. The pharaoh is the male,
Right.
but thinking about the other kingdoms and other cultures that were part of what collapsed in the Bronze Age, kings are normally kings. Kings are men. The monarchs are kings. And a great deal of that has to do, thinking back to that particular, and a lot of the stories of some of those empires as well, it has to do with military prowess and military might. And it has to, the reason that the king is male is the king is expected to lead an army and lead forces. And the logical expectation of that is that that's going to be better done by a
Male.
And it's not that the female offspring of monarchs don't have value historically. In fact, they tend to have value primarily through marriages, through dynastic arrangements. See one whole episode that we did on all of Victoria's kids spreading their genes and then spreading their recessive traits all throughout Europe at the same time.
Like we said, relatives marrying, not the greatest idea.
Not the greatest idea either. But again, this idea of the primary reason the king is male is because of a military bend. And so then it makes perfect sense that as long as you have a male son, if you're the monarch, that should be the monarch.
Correct, yeah.
So, any thoughts more about that, or why that plays out that way, or the significance of that may be different than what immediately comes to mind?
I think you're right. I think that is the kind of the military aspect of it. The kings were expected to lead their troops into battle, and that was just kind of naturally what flowed through. What interestingly just popped in my head is another podcast I was listening to this week, and I believe it was Queen Christina of Sweden, and she was actually called the king because it was like that concept didn't exist in Sweden. So even though she was a woman and she did sit on the throne, she was not called Queen Christina, she was called King Christina. So that was just a weird kind of side rabbit that I chased for a second there. But yeah, I definitely agree with you. I think that the military prowess and the military backing was the kind of the reason why I was like, well, obviously it can't be a woman because they don't lead troops.
So I guess where I would go this, we talked about keeping this more at the general sort of how this has impacted history kind of level in terms of alternate history. Do you think if that had not been the case, now this is where we get into the alternate, so this is not the case, do you think there would have been as much conflict historically if you had more queens versus kings?
I don't think so. Simply because I think, and we have examples of this in history, and not to say that kings weren't good at this aspect of it, but I think queens have historically been known to be a little more diplomatic in their reigns. So I think if we have more queens, I think we have kind of more of the impetus to let's not go to war and just get all up in arms, but let's come to the table and let's try and figure things. I think you would have seen more discussions, more treaties, more interconnectivity, because I think there just would have been, again, I hate to, use the kind of cliche of like women have cooler heads, but I think, if we had more queens in history, I think you would have seen a little bit more of the, let's try and talk this out and maybe not go to war immediately. Maybe use war as a last resort if we can't work this out on paper, as opposed to they just, sorry, I hit the microphone. I got so excited. But instead of just, immediately going to war when something isn't going right, instead, let's take a step back and let's try and figure this out. And then if we can't figure it out, okay, let's go to war.
Yeah, I tend to think that's true in the sense that one of the ways this has influenced history in a big way, and how history was altered by, or not what it would have been or could have been altered to, is that there's males. I think historically, just the way we're designed, the way we are, the way that it is, are much more inclined to be willing, particularly if that's what the norm is, to go to war and to fight it out. Not to say that that's. I don't want to stereotype. That's what I'm trying to avoid here.
Right. That's what I was trying to avoid too.
As I step around it, but the nature of some stereotypes is they contain within them at least some element of widely recognized truth. Whether that's the only reason, not justifying stereotypes. That's certainly not what I'm doing. But there's a reason stereotypes do come to exist in many instances.
Right.
And I do think it makes a difference that it's males and their need to demonstrate, because that's what the position has become, demonstrate their dominance in combat and on the battlefield and all the other places that go with that.
Yeah, right. And I think you touched on something earlier where the women in history and the princesses and the queens in history have kind of been seen as these, again, diplomatic pawns in the terms of marriages and things like that. So I think if you have more queens, it's, well, I don't have to go conquer that country. I can just marry the king. And so I'll be queen of that country as well as queen of my country. And nobody had to go to war.
Yeah. Now, having said that, and it maybe is because of the fact that we've had primogeniture, I think what does happen is the very strong female monarchs throughout history really stand out in a big way. I'm thinking of Catherine of Russia, for example. I'm thinking of...
that's a whole thing.
I'm thinking of, obviously thinking of Elizabeth. I'm thinking of even Mary standing out in a different way than Elizabeth did. I'm thinking of, again, a lot of them just keep coming to mind here. The other one that, sort of one of the other ones that immediately popped into my head, which is sort of different. I'm thinking about, the Austria-Hungarian. I'm thinking about Maria Theresa. Yeah. In fact, I'm remembering. I think this from a World Civilizations or World History class in college. I think there was maybe it was a cathedral palace somewhere. If I've got this wrong, I just apologize because it popped into my head, and I'm not going to research it here on the fly. But it's like the world is being held up in this thing that's on top of a steeple or something like that. And there's three different women that are recognized as being the ones that are, at that time, there were these three powerful women. Catherine of Russia being one of them, I know for sure. And, so what happens because of the male dominance is when there's the opportunity for there to be a female monarch, it's like more attention gets drawn to it because of the rarity. Does that make any sense?
No, that makes total sense. I think, they do kind of stand out as these beacons because they're not the norm. So, that makes total sense.
Yeah, in fact, the other one that just popped into my head, I'm amazed that it didn't pop into my head because it ties back to so often the area that we get wrapped around with the English throne, during the time of the Tudors. But I'm immediately thinking about a certain Spanish monarch who, there's Ferdinand, but then there's Isabella.
Yeah.
And, and the interesting thing there, she was sort of known, from what I understand historically, as being sort of a warrior queen. So she wore
the metaphorical pants in that relationship.
Yeah. And so she also, again, this ties back to the idea of how primogeniture has created the situation for history. She sort of had to almost put on this, I think it was her personality, but this persona where she was a female, but she was a strong female that was able to even exude influence or exert influence in that way.
Yes.
If that makes any sense.
Nope, that makes total sense.
Okay. So, carrying this concept forward, again, we're looking at the big sweep here. other than just the fact that we live in a more modern world, equality of sexes, all the things that go with that, what do you think is the other reason that we finally see primogeniture going away?
I think honestly, I think it's because the queens that we've had have been so influential. And I think part of that is due to the fact that they've maybe had to, exert themselves a little bit more and kind of prove themselves a little bit more. But I think the world is finally realizing that, and I think, Elizabeth II is probably a good example of this just because she's been queen for so long. I mean, she's about to celebrate next year her Platinum Jubilee, I think it is. She's literally the longest reigning British monarch, male or female. I think that's just, I think we, as a society and as a world, I think we've come to realize people's achievements separate from their sex. So it's just, they're a great leader regardless of if they're male or female. And so I think the world is just going that way. And it just happens that we're having more equality and things like that in the world. But I think we're just realizing that a good leader is a good leader regardless of what gender they are.
Yeah. And of course, the other thing that's happened, we talk about this being modern, it's not like the world is ruled by monarchies now either.
Right.
And so even where, not to say that Elizabeth is not an important personage in English culture and in English politics, but she's not the prime minister.
Correct.
And the fact that if George had been Georgette, it would have been okay.
Right.
Is great. But we're also talking about what is now considered more of a symbolic figurehead role position. And so, again, the irony of that to me is that even in this age of more gender equality, more rise and recognition for the status of women, it's only now when the position doesn't matter so much that you actually are allowing women to be in the position, if that makes any sense. There's a certain sense of irony attached to that.
No, there is. It's kind of like, well, now that you're symbolic, we don't really care.
Yeah. And so if, for example, I was immediately thinking about during Elizabeth II's reign, there have been female prime ministers. I guess there have been 2, right? Female prime ministers. Thatcher and.
I can see your face, and I'm
blanking
on her name.
Blank on her name as well. We apologize to
Theresa May.
Theresa May, thank you. We apologize to our English listeners. But there have been 2 female prime ministers during her reign. That was unique. That was new.
Yep.
And even though the monarchy there is no longer being held by primogeniture, the good news is the actual electoral position, the actual political position, was advancing even before that was. There was a female prime minister. In fact, there were 2 female prime ministers before there was direct, without accidentally backing into it.
Yeah, without some
queens.
Son brother jumping.
Yeah. Which leads you back. I know your favorite term is the cousin jump.
Yeah.
But you have the gender jump and the other things that happen because of this going on.
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned one other example. What was that?
So the example that kind of kicked this off in my head, and then it kind of branched off and I thought about other ones. Again, we mentioned this at the beginning. We were going to get to a No Henry VIII, but in a different way. And the way we were going to get to a No Henry VIII under this concept is, of course, we've talked about his older brother Arthur plenty of times on this podcast before, but he actually has an older sister as well. His older sister, Margaret.
And she's queen.
She's queen.
She's just not queen of
England.
She's queen of
Scotland.
Yeah. And so she was the oldest.
She was the oldest girl. Arthur was the oldest.
Right. So Arthur dies.
Yes.
In either scenario, no King Arthur because we have a dead Arthur, right?
He dies before his father, so we have no King Arthur in any scenario.
But Margaret is very much alive, right?
Yes. Yes, she is very much alive. I'm blanking on when she actually goes up to Scotland and marries the king, but it's around the time of her father's death, so she is very much around and a player in this scenario.
And then Henry becomes king.
Correct.
Her brother Henry becomes king. And the result of that is Henry VIII is now on the throne of England. Margaret is married to James.
James the Fourth.
James the Fourth of Scotland. And that does some things with respect to the tensions that had existed between the English and Scottish thrones. But ultimately what happens there is there's a unification of the English and Scottish thrones under James I / James VI. James VI of Scotland, who has the rightful claim to the English throne when Elizabeth dies with no heir. And so you have the union of the English and Scottish thrones under James I of England, James VI of Scotland. He's the James of King James Bible fame.
Yep.
The thing to recognize there is that whole path
doesn't happen.
And why does it not happen if there's no primogeniture?
Because we have no Margaret that needs to go north to find a husband.
Margaret can be queen. She doesn't have to go marry to be queen. She can be queen in her own right. And of course, then you get into all the various ways that the billiard balls bounce off of that and how that rolls through history. But one of the ways you might potentially argue, ultimately you probably do have some union of English and Scottish territory and the crowns there, but not the way it did happen.
Correct. I mean, it could have happened. Basically, they could have married each other, but just kind of in the reverse situation where Margaret becomes Queen of England and she decides she's going to marry the King of Scotland to unite that way, but still, she's Queen of England in her own right. It could be a situation of their kids marry each other. So you could eventually get to the same place, and I'm using air quotes because you can't see me. You could get to the same place, but it's we've talked about this before. You get to what you think is the same place, but it's not the same players because you've changed this one thing.
Right. And so and the result of changing that thing is you have the same people in different roles, which means that things play out. You may get to the same end result, but it plays out in a different way so that it is different.
Right.
And whether that's a big difference or a small difference, that's the interesting thing about alternate history. I guess the other one you mentioned was actually related to later in English history, and that was Victoria, correct?
Yeah, so again, same thing with Victoria. Of course, we've talked about her children, and we've even mentioned her oldest child on a previous episode of the podcast. So her oldest child is actually not Edward VII, her son. It's actually her daughter, Victoria, who's born. And Victoria, again, because we don't have this concept of primogeniture, or we still have the concept of primogeniture, the firstborn does not automatically get the throne. So she actually goes over to this little country called Germany to find her husband, and has this little boy named Wilhelm.
Yeah, this is one of those shame instances when you don't have a good Chris Coppola around to talk about
how we don't get to World War I.
Yeah, Kaiser Wilhelm here. But again, that's just another example of, does that mean that the Germany that arises is not the Germany that arises that becomes the Germany of World War I, the Germany, maybe not. Then it's the bigger questions of history kind of scenario. But it's an interesting what if. And it all ties back to whether it's even necessary for female children of monarchs, based upon their age, in terms of the order of succession, in terms of their birth order, whether it's required for them to leave or not.
Right. In fact, I'm remembering now the PBS series Victoria. There's a scene between Queen Victoria and her son, who eventually does become Edward VII, and he's basically saying, I'm not going to amount to anything, because obviously Vicky's going to be, and, she's having to explain, no, you're the next heir because you're a boy. So, yeah, it's just an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah. Okay. So, I don't know. Again, this is one of those off the cuff. We talked about it conceptually. Didn't want to get into a lot of detail here. But what we do want to encourage is if you can think of very particular interesting twists where
I was going to say, I've got a couple more in my head, but again, they're all English, and I know we got other options here.
Well, the other thing that's interesting to me that even occurred to me, because I looked over my bookshelf and actually saw the novels over there. Yes, the novels. He actually wrote novels. There was a time in history, you may not believe this, when George R.R. Martin wrote and actually published and released, hold on, Lex, books. He had this whole series. Now, he's published other books. He won't actually finish the series.
I was going to say, I'm going to have to go back and read the entire series again by the time the next one comes out.
But the reason that popped into my head, for those of you that are Game of Thrones fans or know there, is that one of the things that's actually dealt with in some of the more intricate subplots, primarily in the books, not so much in the HBO miniseries, the HBO series, is this idea of one of the particular kingdoms, Dorne, does not hold to primogeniture.
Correct.
And so that alters and can change what can happen because they're not bound by the same stipulations, and that ends up producing some marriages. Other things happen in the plot of the books, and of course Martin is stealing heavily where he's stealing heavily from real history there, and the fact that wasn't always the case even in all of the realms and dominions that were associated with England.
Correct. Yeah.
Or in Europe. And so he's stealing and borrowing that and looking at how that would be the potential what if in a fictional world, which then, ties back and mirrors back over to the real world. I'm looking over the bookshelf and saw that, and so that popped into my head. Well, all right, we thank you for joining us here on A Fork in Time. We do encourage you to check out the website, www.aforkintimepodcast.com. You'll find all the good stuff there, how to give topical suggestions, how to give feedback, how to become a patron and support the show if that's something you feel inclined to do. Just all the things that are there. Anything else we want to mention to listeners, Lex?
Go check out the room where it happened.
Yeah, we encourage you to do that. We think you might enjoy it. Again, it's a much longer form podcast, but only once a month. And room number 1 exists. Room number 2 is the topic has been chosen, the die has been cast. All we have to do is set the recording date for that, which will be here in the coming days. And we will continue along that path. We're excited to have launched the second podcast. It was from its first conception in the March-April timeframe to now. It's been a long time coming.
If it just shows you anything about how much fun we have doing this podcast, we were literally on the phone call for, I think, an hour and a half after we stopped recording.
I agree. In fact, one of the things I was tempted to do, except I didn't have the recording of all that discussion because we had stopped with the recording by that point, was we had a great conversation with, if you will, I don't like using the word cast, but the hosts or the
panelists.
The panel. There you go. The panel for room number 1. We had a great time talking just afterwards about the subjects, but also talking about other stuff. And I'm glad you brought that up, Alexis, because we mention it all the time. But that's one of the things I've enjoyed most about this now 2+ year journey is meeting people that are, kindred spirits that have a love of history and have very diverse backgrounds and very diverse understanding of things. And that's one of the things that we enjoy. So if you're one of our listeners, you're in that group. We like to think of you as being part of the extended A Fork in Time family. And we appreciate you giving us a little time today to ramble on generically, but somewhat importantly about whether it matters whether that firstborn child of a monarch is male or female. It actually matters. So we're going to remind you, as we always do, we happen to think that if you happen upon a fork in time, you probably ought to do what, Lex?
Take it.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.